This lecture continues our introduction of classical myth, looking at the cultural context in which it developed and understanding the people, their worldview, and how these stories came to resonate so deeply with the civilization. So we will first go through a history of ancient Greece and then look more specifically at the lives that men and women lived and experienced at the time. And that really helps explain a little bit of the background of what we're going to hear in some of these mythological stories. The ancient Greeks find themselves on the mainland in the easternmost section of Western Europe, in the Peloponnesus, this area that juts out from the mainland. From there, they are going to be able to reach by way of boat and navigation Turkey, or Asia Minor as it was known at the time, to their east, and then Italy to their west. The geographical location of Greece made it an excellent jumping-off point for trading, as they would establish these networks and colonies throughout the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea, and establish these small outposts on the Italian mainland, in Sicily, all the way to Spain, North Africa, and modern-day Turkey. The reason why the Greeks became a trading and maritime empire is related to their geography as well. That being, the mountainous terrain would not allow them to grow large crops or have large herds of cattle. It also discouraged communication early on with the outside world. Therefore, they developed a type of independence that will turn into democracy. Now, lacking farmland, that meant that if they wanted to survive and support a large population, they would need to import the food needed for their people, and thus they traded for these ceramic wares, and then, of course, traded what they had, such as olive oil or more luxury goods. Now, the potter's wheel is going to be developed in the early second millennium BCE, and that allowed them to produce more consistent types of pottery for this trade. We have remnants of it going all the way back past the Bronze Age. Within these vessels, they would of course have olive oil, for they found that olive trees resisted drought and the hot sun of the Greek mainland. They also had large, abundant quarries of limestone and marble at Euboea and Thessaly that they would export throughout the Mediterranean for other areas that did not have and were not rich in this resource. Now, cattle is of course going to be relatively scarce, so you find that there's not much for cattle to forage, thus they're going to be luxury items, and horses especially are seen as symbols of the nobility. Thus, in stories and mythology, we're going to hear over and over again about how important horses are as gifts to kings. Now, the Greek periods relating to the history of ancient Greece begin with the Minoan Age and the early and middle Bronze Age, lasting from 3000 until 1600 BCE. At this time, Crete will be dominant in the Aegean and the Mediterranean as the lone trading superpower. The Greeks would rise on the mainland in the late Bronze Age from 1600 to 1150 BCE. This is the age of Agamemnon and of these Greek heroes we hear about in the Battle of Troy. This is the Mycenaean civilization. This leads to the Dark Ages we'll discuss from 1150 to 800, where there's rampant, widespread illiteracy and a lack of a centralized government. So we don't have records from this period until 800 BCE, when we see the dawn of the Archaic period, where many important historical events are going to take place and set up Greece as a maritime power. Now, in 480, we have the Persian Wars that will officially launch the Classical Age that lasts until 323, or the death of Alexander the Great, spawning the advent of Hellenism. So the Hellenistic period is where Greek civilization spreads throughout all of the known world, all the way over to India. Now, the population of the Greeks are also Indo-Europeans, like many who will settle across Western Europe and Asia. And we find that they share a common root as far as languages and culture. Now, Indo-European civilization is going to be divided into different classes of kings and priests, then warriors that support this hierarchy, and then finally food producers, who are going to be those that are going to allow this lavish lifestyle of the upper class. So they would develop family life, and we know that they are all devoted to war, and especially the Greeks see war as a kind of sport, as we'll discuss. In the early Bronze Age, from 3000 to 1600 BCE, we have the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, south of Greece in the Sea of Crete. Now, this island is going to be the center location for a trading network that the Cretans are going to have a dominant power over in this area. Thus, they are the undisputed masters of the Aegean and Mediterranean at this early Bronze Age stage. It would be Sir Arthur Evans who in 1910 would discover the central palace, as it became known, of Knossos on Crete. Now, Crete, dominating the Aegean, we know had no enemies that could possibly raid them and or sack their city and endanger their civilization. So they did not build cities with walls, otherwise known as citadels. Instead, these wall-less, open, large structures are there for commercial purposes. But this is where the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur took place according to the ancient Greeks. The Minotaur is going to be the son of the wife of King Minos and the bull of Poseidon. Thus he is half man, half bull, we will discuss. The Minotaur finds its way into popular culture to this very day in multiple forms, from video games to movies to TV shows and art. So this mythical creature resonates to this day with, again, our civilization as well. Now, we know very little about the Cretan civilization because the early form of writing used by the Minoans has not been fully translated yet. It's known as Linear A, so an early form of the Greek alphabet. In the late Bronze Age, we see the rise of power on the mainland of Greece proper, the Mycenaean Age, named for Mycenae, the city where we have the citadel, supposedly of Agamemnon, the king who would lead an attack against the Trojans in the Trojan War. This is also known as the Helletic period because the Greeks called themselves the Hellenes. Those are the school of Hellas, in other words. So the Bronze Age on the mainland is the time in which Homer sets his Iliad, and until 1870, it was regarded entirely as myth, that they did not believe the Trojan War actually took place. Until Heinrich Schliemann, another archaeologist, is going to discover Troy just across the Aegean Sea to the northeast, and it was a 13th century BCE city in Turkey. Thus, this Aegean civilization that we're discussing here disappeared by the time we get to Homer, when he wrote down these oral traditions, and they had transformed into the golden age of heroes such as Achilles, Ajax, and Odysseus. We know that the Greek historian Eratosthenes is going to locate the Trojan War lasting a decade from 1194 to 1184 BCE, corresponding almost exactly with the remains that Schliemann found at Troy. So is this the Trojan city that was sacked and burned by the Greeks in this decade-long conflict? Now, this is going to center on one of the most important epic myths that we have, and that is the Trojan War recorded in Homer's Iliad. Now, Linear B script is going to develop in the late Bronze Age, and we might think that it was used for telling myths and recording them, but like the early development of cuneiform writing in Mesopotamia, it was used for record keeping and economic accounting. So that is the earliest use of writing that we have anywhere in the Western world. Only later do they use it to record the events of the gods and myth. So the Mycenaean civilization is going to see that Greek-speaking peoples will displace the local Neolithic culture that is working still with stone because they bring with them metal. Obviously, they can easily brush aside those with metal stone-tipped spears if you're going to have, again, metal swords. So they bring with them metalworking, ceramics, and architectural designs. Now, Mycenae at this time, as mentioned, rises to power, influencing all the islands around it before the Dark Age. Now, this is where we supposedly have, according to history and myth, Agamemnon's citadel. And this is also tied to the legend of Hercules himself, being that the Trojan War occurs around 1200 BCE. So we find that Agamemnon will be the king that tries to avenge his brother's mistreatment when his wife is taken by the Trojan prince Paris. Now, we find that the Mycenaeans are quite different from the Minoans, for they build walled fortresses called citadels. That means that they are subjugating the surrounding countryside and are not as interested in open commerce and trade, that they are enforcing their power in a very violent fashion, so they have to protect themselves. A very different way of life, which gives us an introduction to the Greeks, who are obsessed with war. So the massive citadel would be also the model with a megaron for later Greek temples to the gods. And we find that Agamemnon himself, supposedly, according to Schliemann, was buried here with the treasury of Atreus, that being the loot that he brought back after conquering the Trojans. Now, wealthy Mycenaeans, we do know, were buried outside of the citadel in what are known as tholos, or beehive-shaped tombs. So unlike what Homer was familiar with in his own time, so he would not have recognized these as tombs. The structures, these beehive tombs as they became known, would be entered through a long dromos, or entryway, a passage that prepares you for communing with the dead. This entry hallway is going to lead to a central area where the dead would be laid out on the ground, not buried. Men would be accompanied by the instruments associated with their lives, such as weapons, swords, shields, and women would also be adorned with jewelry and with finery. Turning to the Dark Age, in 1150 to 800 BCE, we find the downfall of the Mycenaean civilization, and with it comes disorganization, depopulation, and widespread illiteracy across ancient Greece. And because no one can read and write, we do not have record of what occurred during this period. The Archaic period is the revival of civilization, trade, and writing in ancient Greece, and begins in 800 and lasts until 480 BCE. This moves us towards and prepares for the Classical Age that everyone is familiar with today, that gave us the foundations for Western civilization. Now, the Greek alphabet is invented at this time in 800 BCE, where Homer and Hesiod will use this as the language to write down the myths that we all know today of the Olympians and great battles. There are 22 signs in the Greek alphabet. The first writing that encoded the sound of the human voice can be found here. The Phoenicians develop it elsewhere. So at this time in the Archaic era, we see the development of city-states, otherwise known as polis. So these city-states are going to first be seen in Corinth and then in Athens in the 6th century, or the 500s. They are ruled by demos. These are going to be individuals who participate in assembly. They own their own property. They can speak freely in public, vote, hold office, and are the only ones required to go to war. The Greeks called themselves the Hellenes, as they are the school of Hellas, hence we get the word Hellenistic. The Romans were the ones that named them Greeks, and would call those that preferred Greek culture Greculus, for instance. So here we find that the Greeks are very different from their Egyptian or Mediterranean counterparts, in that for them, gods are just immortal humans. As Protagoras would say, man is the measure of all things, right? Not the gods. So the gods look like us. They have foibles. They behave like us. They have passion. They, once again, can be harmed and can feel pain. So there are no gods or kings for the Greeks because their very understanding of the universe and divinity itself is centered in the material world. The Greek periods of art, importantly, moving from the geometric to the Hellenistic, are going to evolve incredibly rapidly as we see this interest and obsession with showing the perfect individual, usually the perfect athletic warrior. So moving from the archaic to the left to the Hellenistic at the right, we see figures becoming ever more naturalistic, obsessed with a mathematical formula, to those that eventually are going to reveal the emotional states of the characters. Now, the rapid evolution is not entirely Greece's own, because they borrow greatly from the cultures in ancient Egypt and the Near East. The poses of the first Greek statues come from ancient Egypt, for instance, and they borrowed ideas about the gods and their roles from those in Turkey or modern-day Asia Minor. In the 6th century, we have the introduction of coinage as well, and a new commercial class. Thus, this allows the rise of democracy as we know it, where civilization is not ruled by aristocrats born into power, but instead those that rise to power by way of their own talents. So from 650 to 500 BCE, cities will be ruled by tyrants as they become known. These individuals represented the commercial class and protected their interests against the aristocracy, the old guard who already had all the power. So you find that the aristocrats who are writing myth and are in charge of stories as we know them in history itself were the ones that gave tyrants this negative connotation. They actually are just middle-class representatives. With the rise of the Persian Empire from the 6th century BCE as they defeat Babylon, they spread on trying to attack Greece itself in 480 BCE, and eventually will have an empire that spreads from Western Europe, North Africa, all the way to India. Because of the aggressions of the Persian Empire, we find Greek identity crystallizing as they have a common foe. First, the Persians attacked the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. A decade later, in 480, they will come back again. We find that the early attempt to conquer them was staved off by the Athenians and others. The Persian Wars, as Herodotus will record them, begin with Marathon in 490 and the more popular, now known Thermopylae of 480 BCE. In each one of these, we get the development and a good insight into Greek warfare and how it changes in this period leading to the classical age. For the Greeks would fight as a hoplite warrior, as they are known, with a bronze helmet and shield and a spear, fighting in phalanx later on. This begins the classical age as they defeat the Persians in 480 BCE, led by Leonidas, the king of the Spartans, and Themistocles, the naval commander of the Athenian navy. This leads to the unification of the Greek states and an identity set apart from those in the Near East. They're saying they are different than those that attacked them. So obviously, if you are reasonable, you're rational, and you once again are going to be religious and you fear the gods, then your enemies are the opposite. They are brutish and barbaric. So here we have the high point of the Greeks that everyone is familiar with today, where we have Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus writing dramas that we all still hear told today in different versions. Herodotus invents history as we know it, chronicling events. Pericles is the model for statesmen still used today around the world. And Socrates invents philosophy and the Socratic method. Herodotus, importantly, invents the very word history, which means inquiry in Greek, to inquire into the causes of the Persian defeat, trying to explain why the Greek civilization was superior. Thus, history itself is biased and attempts to confirm what is already known. So confirmation bias is a part of it. It was at this time in the classical age that we see the shift, as philosophy now offers us an alternative to myth in explaining the world and natural phenomenon. That Plato and Aristotle both challenged the accounts in myth that the gods shape the world and natural events. Instead, we now look for rational explanations. The historian Thucydides is also going to reject this convention that gods determine human events, and instead place it securely particularly in our realm, that being we are the ones that shape our own destiny and history. So the Greek periods leading to the late classical age, where we see this explosion of ideas, the establishment of philosophy, developments in drama, and of course advances in mathematics, is challenged because of the Peloponnesian Wars. Now we find that the late classical era will find that moves from the end of the Peloponnesian War to the death of Alexander the Great. The Peloponnesian War is going to take place on the Peloponnesus, where it gets its name, the southernmost tip of Greece, and is fought between the Athenian superpower, who came out on top after the Persian Wars, and Sparta, who despised being told what to do. So the outcome of the war finds Sparta, not surprisingly, winning control of the mainland, while Athens, with its large navy, still controlling its own maritime empire. So we find that Sparta, defeating Athens in 404 BCE, sets up this pro-Spartan government that is so oppressive that within years the Athenians rebelled and killed the leader Critias, restoring democracy there. Athens recovers its independence at this time, but never regains its position as the dominant power in ancient Greece. Instead, it retains its reputation as a center for artistic and intellectual life. In 387 BCE, for instance, Plato founds a school outside of Athens that is the model for the modern-day university or academy, the Academia, taking its name from the patch of grass on which the students met outside of the city. His student Aristotle would do the same thing, founding another school, and would teach the young Alexander of Macedon, who would become Alexander the Great. He is the son of Philip II, the king of Macedon, who is going to be defeating the Athenians by 338 BCE, conquering all of Greece. But he is then assassinated in 336 BCE, leaving his young 20-year-old son Alexander III as the sole king and ruler of all of Greece and Macedonia, the area to the north of ancient Greece. Now, Alexander the Great will then lead his new Greek army in a war of revenge and conquest against the Persians, for he blamed them for their attack in 490 and 480, thus uniting the Greeks in one cause again to defeat the Persians and expand the Greek Empire all the way to India and Egypt. This conquest, leading from the downfall of the Persians in Turkey today, would then take Alexander's army to Egypt, where he would be called a god by Egyptian priests, all the way over to India before they turned back in 323 BCE, making his empire the largest in all of history at this point. So this empire would spread Greek culture and ideas far and wide, including art. The ability of Alexander's army to sweep away opposition was, of course, aided by new technologies, such as the Gastrophides, this belly-shooting massive crossbow, and the sarissa, a 20-foot-long spear, so the enemy could not even get close to Alexander's army. Now, with the death of Alexander the Great, we see the fall of Egypt to Augustus ends the Hellenistic period. Thus, Greek culture is exported throughout the known world. And then when the Romans take over, they as well adopt Greek culture, these ideas, art, gods, myth. Now, the information that we have about Greek society in general comes primarily from Athenians, specifically aristocratic males, as we mentioned, from the 5th and the 4th century. So we need to understand that it is highly biased. So social life is going to be dominated by these free males, only ones at this time who are actually required to fight in wars. Now, they are educated both from a literary standpoint and an athletic one. It is important for any Athenian aspiring male to power that they also need to understand myth. They memorize Homer, they understand the great works of literature, but also are going to be quite fit and athletic, which prepares them for war. So this is a highly competitive community that the Greeks are going to establish, in which one's worth is taken account of by one's wit and ability to entertain at symposia, which is where we hear most myths are going to be recounted. So the symposia, you have a group of men who come together in order to share ideas and be entertained. So the life of an Athenian male would unfold as follows. From 6 years of age until 13, he would receive instruction from a pedagogue, where we get our word pedagogical, to teach. Originally, this word means the trainer of boys, where they would learn to read and write and memorize the poetry, especially of Homer, with the Iliad and the Odyssey. At this time, boys would live in the women's quarters of the home before they reached adulthood. At 18, he would become a citizen, at that time being allowed to vote and speak in public, moving out of the women's quarters. From 18 to 20, there would be an initiatory rite of passage where he would dress as a woman, disrobe and break from the woman's ways and leave the women's part of the house. In his 20s, he would also then come full circle in this teaching strategy, and he would begin to court prepubescent boys, the first sexual and romantic encounters that men had at this time, because they would not marry until much later. So at this time, they would also participate in symposia, where they would be entertained by hetairae, or these courtesans, these women who would entertain them both through music and other sexual means. Now, warfare at this time is constant. There is not a time in which there is not war except in the winter months or times of harvest. So we find that half of the male population would die in war. Early on in the Bronze Age, we know from stories in the Bible and elsewhere, from the Iliad, for instance, with Achilles, that single fighters would challenge one another mano a mano. Moving into the classical age, warfare changes to fighting in military units of hoplite warriors as members of a team, shoulder to shoulder with shields out front and spears once again to move forward. This is going to be recounted in popular culture in numerous ways, and of course, television, in movies, video games, and more. Thus, for the Greeks, sport was practice for war, and war was a kind of sport. So this is important to understand the mentality relating to warfare that is rather alien from our own. Now, in a man's mid-30s, he would have already gone to war. He already reached adulthood, but he would not marry until he was in his 30s. At this time, he would marry a woman around 14 years of age. Women's lives are very different at the time, and we know very little about them because sources on women are heavily biased, and Greek civilization is quite misogynistic and sexist. So all the accounts are written by women. What we know is that they grew up in the gynekion, the women's quarters, where they would learn the arts of spinning wool and making cloth, but not reading and writing. So they would entertain each other, not with the great myths of Homer, but instead these fables. So this comes into play and is brought into later myth we will discuss. So there is a proverb in ancient Greece which explains quite a bit about the man's perspective of a woman's life. And it says that a woman knows two great moments in life, her marriage and her death. Thus, of course, we find that she is entirely devoted to and is expected to be devoted to her family as a wife. However, monogamy among men is very unusual. We find that several different partners would be expected of a successful man in ancient Greece. Women, of course, must remain loyal because a legitimate heir can only come from one wife, one primary wife, and so it cannot be questioned whose child that is. Marriages, of course, have nothing to do with love and romance as we understand them today. They are arrangements. There is very little affection as we understand it. They are political and economic arrangements in order to ensure the success of a family. Thus, dowries are going to be paid, right, to the man's family from the wife in order to ensure they have a say on what happens to their daughter once they leave their home. So with women, their life is going to unfold as follows. They are first a parthenos, a virgin, when they are married at 14 years of age, or when they first get their menses. So they are only eligible for marriage if they are virginal, and even so, a father can sell his daughters off into slavery even if they are raped. So the ideal is to marry off a daughter as soon as possible before she reaches sexual maturity, because it is very dangerous at that time for women, it is understood. So before marriage, this dangerous time would relate women to Artemis, the goddess of the wild and of the hunt. She is untamed, untethered by men. She runs wild in the forest. This is how they viewed women that needed to be tamed by a man. Because after marriage, she is no longer Parthenos. She is a nymphe, or a bride, where we get the term, of course, nymphomaniac. So then, when she becomes a mother and gives birth, she becomes a gyne, where we get the word gynecological. And she is a woman at that time. That's what makes her a woman, is the act of having a child. And so this is when she takes control of the household from the older woman in the house, and now is in charge of all the aspects of running the home, including the finances. Now, only women can purify what is known to the Greeks as enormous pollution, or miasma. This will come about several times. The only other person who can do this is Apollo, you'll see, a god. Because women are in charge of childbirth and tending to the dead, these are seen as activities that can taint one and leave this type of pollution on the individual. They are unclean. So women have the ability to clean these pollutions. So birth and death are attended over only by women. Now, the ideal Greek family, and this is very telling, is 3 children. And this is going to continue into the early modern era and even today in many parts of the world. You want 3 children because 2 of them need to be boys and 1 a girl. 1 boy you can expect to die in war, so you need another one to carry on your family name. And you need 1 girl to assist in the formation of interfamilial alliances. So you need to marry her off so that you have these arrangements in civilization with other families. So we find that if you only need 1 girl, as happened in China and other areas, if people had 2 girls, they would often abandon them and leave them to die. So if they were found, these women were often raised as prostitutes or slaves. Now, slavery is what supports the Athenian economy and the ancient world. This is also true for the Romans. We find that 1/4 to 1/3 of the workforce in Athens are slaves. And it's affordable. Even the most modest household could afford a slave. And this makes possible the leisure that allows democracy to happen. You can't be thinking about philosophical concepts or arguing in law courts if you need to do the laundry or cook or clean. You need someone else to do that, to open up your ability to learn and to expand. Now, slaves had no rights, thus they could be killed or sexually used at any given moment. So Heracles, for instance, the Greek version of Hercules, is sold into sex slavery to Queen Omphale. Now, they could, however, receive salaries that they could save up and purchase their freedom if their owner allowed it. Turning to religion, we find that the Greeks believe in polytheistic deities, so many gods rule the world and dwell within it. And there is no notion of one all-powerful, benevolent God who gives us a code of conduct like the 10 Commandments. The Greeks have no concept of religious morals in this way, because the gods do not provide them the parameters for living. Instead, the gods are just expected to be respected and honored. Thus, we have no divine writings to direct us otherwise. Now, this requires priests, both male and female, depending upon who you're trying to appease, and requires the performance of appropriate rituals in order to appease these gods. So just like today, in a very different fashion, in order to gain a god's goodwill, the idea is you should destroy what you value, hence sacrifice. So we find that many ancient civilizations perform human and animal sacrifices for this reason. It pleases the gods because you are giving up something that you value. Just like, of course, Agamemnon sacrifices his own daughter Iphigenia to launch the Trojan War. This gets the gods on their side. So in religious activity, what we find is people are not asking the gods to help them out in the next life. They do not. They want help in this life to, of course, make them powerful or wealthy, to protect them. Thus, there's no understanding of guilt or sin because everyone dies and goes to Hades, the same place, unless one horribly offends the gods and is sent to Tartarus that we will discuss. So Athenian intellectuals would abandon this idea and religion in the classical age in favor of reason. So we find that humans, according to the Athenians, make their own worlds, not the gods. And this is the cornerpiece to Western civilization that we still have today. This notion of separation of church and state, of the idea that we are framing things, not supernatural forces. Now, the worldview, however, among many others in ancient Greece, remember that the Athenian intellectual class is but a minority. So just like today, we find that religion is still widely practiced around the world. So the beliefs and customs that are understood to be a given for these people are as follows. The worldview at this time is one of a belief in magic, that magic actually exists and can happen. And the world can be manipulated as such with such magic rituals and spells, that words embody power, such as curses, and this power can influence physical matter. Now, we find that these natural forces are often given human qualities. Of course, not surprisingly, different gods are in charge of different parts of nature. So the world is also inhabited by ghosts and supernatural characters as well that can influence human behavior. Now, also, animals will have human qualities, such as being able to speak, and humans can be born not of women, but of other objects and creatures, such as trees and animals. We find this in myth quite often. And then finally, humans, it was believed, can transform, and this is true among many cultures today, into animals or inanimate objects. So finally, gods can also influence the world in another way. They can impregnate humans, leading to the birth of demigods, people with special qualities and powers. Thus, the worldview is all events are connected in some way. Now, the development of classical myth is as follows. Greek culture is actually an offshoot of Mesopotamian culture, like Roman culture is an offshoot of Greek culture. So the earliest freestanding sculptures of goddesses that we have are of fertility, such as at Çatalhöyük. Here, like Artemis, we have a woman with large breasts with her hands on spotted panthers, known as the Lady of the Beasts. So early on, we have this understanding of fertility associated with women, just like the Venus of Willendorf, as it is known. Now, Sumerian myth, which is the foundation for Greek myth, believes that each city has its own protective deity, just like every Catholic city today has a patron saint, and that they would live in the city center on top of a ziggurat. So this is recorded in cuneiform writing, and they had hundreds of gods. The development of Greek myth can be seen to adopt many of these gods from the Sumerians, and they are as follows. We have On, a sky god, who is the original supreme authority. We have Inanna, the queen of heaven, who is the goddess of sexual love and war, who is insatiable. She has 120 lovers that could not satisfy her, so thus she is the precursor to Aphrodite. We have Enlil, the lord of the storm, the god of unruly violence, who is involved in earthly events like Zeus. We have Anki, the lord of earth, who ruled groundwater beneath the soil. He is the god of wisdom and magic, so you must imagine Hades. And then Ki, the earth mother goddess, is seen as the counterpart to Demeter. Now, Ereshkigal is the queen of the great below and can be seen as the goddess of death, like Persephone. Now, we know that they are vague, however, about the physical appearance of these gods. They're all anthropomorphic, so they have human bodies, along with human passions, ambition, anger, and lust. Thus, these are the precursors to the Greek gods, that they are looking to the Near East and these gods and adopting aspects of them and changing their names. In Semitic or Jewish myth, we know that in 2300, Sumer is going to be conquered by the Semites. The Akkadians are going to take the Sumerian gods and pass them on to the Babylonians. So we see this shift and this cross-cultural emphasis on these gods that are shared among these various civilizations, and they change them a bit to match their own cultural expectations. Now, the Hebrews were the ones that adopted monotheism, or the belief in one God, from the pharaoh Akhenaten when they were in Egypt, and took the creation story along with the universal flood story from them. So now we find the Old Testament being written centuries later during the Babylonian captivity in 586 BCE, in which we finally have the Bible compiled as Christians know it and as we know it today in 90 Common Era during the Roman Empire. So this happens quite late, and these ideas are shared across these various civilizations. Now, myth in the Archaic period for the Greeks, who is going to be looking to these earlier stories and adopting them, are going to be developed in the Mycenaean age, but not written down until the Archaic period in the 700s by Homer, as he writes the Iliad and Odyssey, or Hesiod, who writes the Theogony, the Works and Days. The Iliad, remember, is going to chronicle the weeks in the 10th year of the Trojan War, while the Odyssey is going to chronicle the epic deeds of the hero Odysseus on the decade-long home trip that he takes back to Ithaca. The Theogony is the origin of the gods, literally is what it means, and it's all of the creation myths that are going to be compiled, while Works and Days by Hesiod is going to be wisdom literature, or a kind of moral treatise on how to behave. But it is important to remember that despite these most important mythographers and these stories recorded first in the Archaic era, there is no official version of a myth. There is no sacred text with the authority of the Bible, and there's no institution with that authority like the church. Instead, they are going to develop ethics to learn how to live, very important for today, which is a way of determining right and wrong without divine authority. So how do we know that it's wrong to murder someone if a supernatural figure doesn't tell us as such? How do we know that it's wrong to steal from another person? Well, we develop ethics and reason through why that might be incorrect or improper behavior. So before writing, aristocrats would entertain one another by oadoi, these illiterate singers that would sing the myths in didactic hexameter with rhythmic phrases. They were never told the same way twice, and this is perfectly fine. That being, we have the main ideas that are going to be put forth, but they can be changed. The details can be altered. So after that, rhapsodies, or memorized versions of that, were recreated from the original score. Hence, this is how we have the development of myth. People sing myth in various ways. They're eventually recorded, and then that becomes later on a type of strict unified version of it. So the best classical sources for myth actually come from tragedy. Aristotle would state that tragedy allows audiences to experience intense and sometimes disturbing emotions that could not be experienced in real life without a terrible cost. Aeschylus, for instance, is going to deal with grand moral issues with these divine characters, such as gods motivating the action. Sophocles, on the other hand, believes that fate stands behind the events of man and that men are as they ought to be. Euripides, finally, is going to be the passionate tragedy writer and believes an erotic emotion is going to drive action, that he shows men as they are, not as they ought to be. The Roman appropriation of myth comes by way of Virgil and Ovid. Virgil's Aeneid, which is going to be commissioned by the first Roman Emperor Augustus, recounts the fall of Troy to the foundation of Rome. Thus, it has the fullest description of the underworld as well. Ovid's Metamorphoses, on the other hand, is going to find a collection of myth for entertainment purposes. We do not have a religious overtone any longer in Ovid, which is interesting because the Metamorphoses is the most comprehensive collection of all of these myths, but is told to entertain, not to instruct or to be used as a religious text. Therefore, myth for the Romans, and as it is passed down to us today, is primarily for entertainment. It still embodies social mores. It still reinforces proper behavior of what men or women should do or strive to be. But it's fun, and that is, of course, one of the most endearing and enduring parts of myth to this day. Next class, we're going to delve into myths of creation and the rise of Zeus. How did Zeus become the primary Olympian and the ruler of the universe?